Thank you so much for tuning in with us here at Seven City Church. Our prayer is that this message would help you know Christ, encourage you to experience community, and help you influence culture like never before. We hope you enjoy today's message.
So a few weeks ago when we kicked off this series, we've been taking a look at the 23rd Psalm. The King David, King of Israel, wrote this psalm later during his lifetime, and it's become the most well-known psalm in the entire book. There's 150 psalms, and this one is the one that people turn to time and time again. It begins with those all too common words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." And we find this shepherd language, if you will, all throughout Scripture, both the Old and the New Testament. In fact, when you come into the New Testament, Jesus also used this language in the Gospel of John whenever he made the statement that I am the good shepherd. And aren't you glad he's not a bad shepherd? He's not a mediocre shepherd. He's not the best they had that day shepherd. He's a good shepherd, and he's faithful, and he's trustworthy. So over the last few weeks, we've discovered that the good shepherd takes his sheep, that's you and I, the followers of God, on a spiritual journey. And that journey oftentimes goes into green pastures, as places where you experience God's flourishing, His blessing, beside quiet waters, along right paths. But also we see in this psalm where the good shepherd also leads us through our darkest valleys. And some of you may be walking through one of those right now. And the good news is that in the dark valley, the shepherd doesn't say, I'll see you on the other side. He walks through the dark valley with us, and he's guiding us every step of the way. And as we come out of that dark valley, we go on to what the Scripture calls the table. It's like the table land, this elevated land where the sheep would graze, and it might be surrounded by rimrock, and the enemies would, lions and bears and different things, the enemies would look down onto the rimrock and see the sheep. But because the shepherd had gone in advance to prepare the land for the shepherd's arrival, the sheep were protected, the sheep were safe, the shepherd understood exactly what they needed in that moment. And so when we come to verse 6, and that's where we're going to focus our attention today, David writes these words. Verse 6, he says, "Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever." You see, at the end of each day, the shepherd would lie down at the gate to the sheepfold. And the reason he would do that is so that the sheep didn't escape, but also so that there wasn't an attack from the outside on the sheep. And as he would lay down at the gate, he would spend his final moments of that day reflecting on his day and giving thanks to God. Giving thanks to God for two things, for God's goodness and for His unfailing love. And so I want us to unpack those two parts of this passage for a few moments, goodness and God's unfailing love, because that's what David is reflecting on in this moment. So again, verse 6, "Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me." Now, what was God's goodness? God's goodness was expressed in a couple of ways. In fact, there's two perspectives you can have on God's goodness. One is that God's goodness is a reflection of His provision, and secondly, it's a reflection of His presence. Let's talk about the first one. God's goodness was revealed by His provision. And let's just be honest for a moment. Isn't that how most of us think about God's goodness? Like it's revealed by His provision. And so we think of God's goodness as His blessing. We think of God's goodness as His favor. We think of God's goodness as Him opening up new doors for us, an opportunity. And that is part of God's goodness. In fact, if we're really honest, we kind of think of like God's goodness like a Christmas list, right? Like when you were a kid, remember you'd make your Christmas list for mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or maybe even your friend, right? And you had your list of all the things you wanted for Christmas. And some of you're here today, you're like, what are you talking about? When I was a kid, I still do, right? That's every, like 4 months from now, baby, like it's happening again. And so we've got this list. Well, here's the deal. Whenever it comes to God's goodness, we've kind of got a list for Him too. Can we just be really honest? Like we've all got those things that we would like God to do for us. We all have those things that we'd like to see God provide for us. Those things that He can do that maybe we can't do for ourselves. And here's the good thing about God. Not only do you and I like to receive gifts, but we serve a God who actually likes to give gifts. Now, I don't mean that in a way of manipulation or in a way of that's perverting the gospel. It's not like a name it, claim it type of thing. It's nothing like that. It's just the fact that God in his very nature is good. And because he is good, he enjoys giving good gifts to his people. In fact, James said this, James chapter 1, and he said, every good and perfect gift. Notice he didn't say every bad and mediocre gift. He said every good and perfect gift is from above. From who? It's coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. We serve a God who actually enjoys providing for his people. He's a good dad. He's a good father. He's a trustworthy father, and that is one way his goodness is expressed to us, is by the provision that he provides to us. Now, here's the sad part. Oftentimes, that's where we end God's goodness. We end his goodness at whatever our list is of all the things we think God should do for us, right? Whether it's a good list or not, we think it's good. But that's where we end our understanding of God's goodness is his provision. Can I tell you, there's another dimension of God's goodness that is even greater, and that is his presence. God's goodness is revealed by his presence. We see this in the life of Moses. When Moses was leading the Israelites through the wilderness, what happened? God raised up Moses to deliver his people from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And so as they leave Egypt, they walk through the wilderness. As he's leading them through the wilderness, Moses makes a statement to God that really gets to the crux of his goodness being revealed by his presence. Look what Moses says in Exodus 33. Then Moses said, if you don't personally go with us, this is Moses talking to God. If you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. For your presence among us sets your people and me apart from all other people on the earth. What was Moses doing? Moses was saying, God, we've come this far. But God, we're not taking another step unless we know you're with us. God, we're not moving forward one more step unless we know you will go with us. Why? Because Moses understood this, that it is far better to be in a wilderness with God than outside of a wilderness without God. He understood that God's presence was the sustaining factor in his life and in the people of Israel's life. He understood that God being with you matters more than anything else. And oftentimes we think, well, no, as long as I got the provision, I'm good. Moses understood, provision or not, his presence is what makes the greatest difference. His presence is the game changer in our lives. And you see, this is the thing. Oftentimes, our thought is this, is that God, would you bless whatever it is I'm doing with your presence? And yet God works the opposite. God says, why don't you just get in my presence? Why don't you just get on my agenda instead of your own, because my agenda is already blessed. We tend to say, well, this is the path I'm going to go. Now, come on, Lord, give me a little bit of that Jesus blessing stuff because I need the help. And God says, why don't you just get on my agenda, because it's already a blessed path. If you'll just walk in it, you'll experience my blessing, because it's already what I'm blessing now. And so Moses leaves and he's saying, listen, it's not our path that matters, it's your path. So God, we're not taking another step unless we know you're with us. That's why, hear me, that's why the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night was not something that followed the Israelites, but rather it was something they followed. There was this cloud that came over them by day to, help with, obviously the heat and everything. There was this fire that appeared at night, literally, like physically. They could see this. And it led the Israelites through the wilderness. But notice, it wasn't behind them, it was in front of them. It was leading them. So it wasn't about God follow us and bless us. It was we're going to follow you because we know that's the path that's already blessed. So Moses makes this request, says, if you don't go with us, God, we're not moving. And notice how God responds to Moses. This is what he says. I will make all my goodness pass before you. As my glorious presence passes by, I will hide you in the crevice of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. What was God doing? He's saying, okay, Moses, I'm going to go with you, but let me give you a glimpse. Let me give you a taste of my presence right now. And he said, you know what? I'm going to hide you in the crevice of the rock. And the reason why is because God, if you keep reading the passage, you discover God said, look, if you see my face, you'll die. So I'm just going to pass by and let you see my goodness. I'm going to hide you and you'll experience my goodness as I pass by. God's goodness was not just a matter of provision, it was a matter of his very presence among Moses and the Israelites. That's how God's goodness is revealed. Let me say it another way. Being good is God's nature. Being good is God's nature. It is who he is. Somebody said it like this once. The goodness of God is the sum total of all of God's attributes. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times we don't see it that way. And the reason is because we're looking through a different lens. Okay, think about it like this. Like I wear glasses, and so if I take them off, I can see you, but I can't. You know what I'm talking about? Like I know you're there, but you're all blurry right now, and so I can't make out features or anything like that. Like you're all blurry. But as soon as I put these on, all of a sudden, wow, it's like everything kind of comes to life. I can see. Well, here's the thing. In life, we all live with a set of lenses, not physical lenses, not glasses, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but we all wear a certain set of lenses in life that is the thing we see all of life through. And so sometimes those lenses are negative lenses, sometimes those lenses are positive lenses. When those lenses are positive lenses, like it doesn't matter what's happening in life, when you wear that positive set of lenses, you see whatever's happening to you through a positive lens. So, some people, it's like they could have cancer, that's a negative thing, but their response is, well, thank God I'm not dead. It's like, but you have cancer. I know, but thank God I'm still alive. What are they doing? They're seeing life through a positive lens. So somebody could drop their cell phone in the toilet, and they would say, well, thank God I'd already flushed, right? They're seeing life through a positive lens. That's their framework. That's their mindset. They view life that way. But how many know other people, the lens they look at life through is negative. So when they see life, it doesn't matter how good something is, it's never good enough. The tax refund is never big enough. The vacation is never long enough. It's like no matter how much good, how much blessing, how much provision, how good God has been to them, it just isn't enough. And so everything is seen through this negative lens where it's just like, well, it could be better. Well, that's not enough. Well, how come they didn't try harder? And it dampens everything. Here's where the problem is. The problem is that if you're wearing a negative lens, we tend to project that onto God. In fact, whatever lens you're wearing, positive or negative, you tend to view God, not just your circumstances, through that same set of lenses. So if you're wearing a positive lenses, then you look at God and you see quickly the goodness of God. But if you're wearing negative lenses, what do you do when you look at God? You look at him through that lens, so you project onto him the difficulty and the hardship you're dealing with now. So you look at your difficult circumstances and you say, well, God must not be good. You look at your deteriorating health and you say, well, God must not be good. You look at the pain that you're going through and the battle you're having to fight and the hardship, and you project it onto God and say, well, God must not be good. You let your negative lens project itself onto how you see God himself. But if we would understand who God truly is, if we would shift our lens, shift our focus, and understand who he really is and his very nature, suddenly it begins to affect everything. You see, here's what happens whenever it comes to the negative lens. Rather than letting God's nature define our circumstances, we let our circumstances define God's nature. Let me say that again. When you wear the negative lens, rather than letting God define your circumstances, you let your circumstances define the nature of God. And yet that's a dangerous place to be, because what happens, we begin to let our circumstances define the goodness of God as not being so good. God's nature is good, and here's the thing, because it's good, he can even bring good out of the bad. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Look what Paul says. And we know that God causes everything, not some things, not a few things, everything, to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Now notice, Paul didn't say everything was good. Paul wasn't denying the hardships of life. I mean, you can look at his life, and it's very clear. He had plenty of hardships in his lifetime. But Paul refused to let those hardships become his lens for how he saw God. Instead, understanding the goodness of God, he was able to look at the hardships he went through, the pain he went through, and say, you know what? Even in my hardship, even in my pain, God has a way of even working that junk out for my good. For my good. And the only way you can see that way is to wear a different set of lenses. To understand this is who God is. This is the goodness of God, even in the midst of my hardship. And you can go all your life complaining about why everything is not as it should be and how bad it is and how hard it is. But how many of you know it never changes anything when you complain about it? Has complaining ever solved any of your problems? Well, yeah, I went to this restaurant one time and I gave him a piece of my mind and I got free dessert. Well, now you're a grumpy person with free dessert. It didn't change you into a better person. God has the ability to look at the pain, and hear me. I didn't say the pain came from God. I'm saying God has a way to look at the pain that is a result sometimes of our own ignorance. Sometimes of our own bad decisions, sometimes just because we live in a fallen world and we live with so much junk. But God has the ability, regardless of the source of the pain, to look at it and say, you know what, I didn't cause that, but I can sure pull some gold out of it if you'll let me. If you'll let me. Now, God's goodness is one thing that David said will follow him all the days of his life. But there's a second thing. God's goodness wasn't the only thing, but the second thing was God's unfailing love. Look again, Psalm 23, verse 6. David says, surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me. And unfailing love will pursue me. The love that David refers to in this passage is not a romantic love. It's not a friendship love. It's not a, I love chocolate cake love. It's a covenant love. It was a love that would never cease. It was a love that would not run out. It was a love that would last forever. It was a love that didn't abandon you. It was a love that wasn't broken and didn't abandon you in your brokenness. It was this covenant love. And here's the thing, and some of you may need to hear this today and really get this deep inside your soul. God never has to debate with himself over whether or not he still loves you. Let me say that again. God never has to debate with himself over whether or not he still loves you. Why? Because his love is unfailing. It never has a short in it. It never reaches this place where it doesn't work any longer. In fact, I think the best way to think about this, and you've heard me share this before, but I really think it's worth repeating, it's worth hearing. Think about for a moment your worst day of your life as it relates to something you did wrong. I know some of you are like, I did not come to church to hear this, okay? Just hang with me for a minute, okay? Think about a moment in your life, a day in your life when maybe you did something or you said something or you acted a certain way or you treated somebody a certain way. It was something and you look back and it's just like nothing but regret for that day. Think of your worst day, that day when you know you were not on your A game and something happened that you wish you had never done that. Hold that thought. Now let's think about the opposite. Think about your best day. Think about a day whenever maybe you loved really well. You treated your family really well. You helped a friend. You helped a total stranger. Think of a day where you just feel like, man, on this day I was on my game and I made a difference for somebody else. Maybe you even point to a success that you had at work and you're like, man, I really delivered. Man, I even got an award. Like they gave me a bonus. Something happened at work and you're like, man, I nailed it there. Okay, you got it? Think about your worst day. Think about your best day. On which day did God love you the most? It was the same. Why? Because none of us earn his love. Worst day, best day, he still loved you the same. Worst day, best way, his love never stopped. If anybody understood this, it was David. You see, when you read David's story, you discover very quickly this man had some faults. In fact, one day, David experiences God's unfailing love through his deepest, darkest valley. Because you see, one day, David commits adultery with a lady named Bathsheba, who was already married. And when he finds out that she's pregnant, he finds out where her husband is at in the battle, and he orders that her husband be put on the front lines of the battle so that he would be killed, which he was. And after he was killed, then David takes Bathsheba as his wife. Now, how many know that's not good, right? How many say, okay, I will chalk that up as sin, right? That's not a win. That's a bad day, right? That's bad. Those are bad decisions that affect multiple people. That was sinful. And in all of that, David thinks he gets away with it until a prophet named Nathan shows up one day and calls David out on his sin. So what does David do in his deepest time of need? He writes Psalm 51. And I want you to notice what verse 1 says. David has committed sin. He's been caught. He says, "Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins." And if you read the remainder of Psalm 51, the entire psalm is David confessing his sin, repenting of his sin, and seeking restitution with God, seeking restoration of his relationship with God. What on earth would make David think his relationship with God could be restored? He understood God's unfailing love. He understood that in his deepest, darkest, ugliest valley, that God still loved him. So much that God wanted their relationship restored even more than David did. I think a beautiful example of God's unfailing love is seen in the life of Nicky Cruz. Nicky Cruz was born in Puerto Rico to parents who not only abused him, but were also involved in witchcraft. And whenever Nicky was 15 years old, his parents sent him to live with his brother in New York City. But whenever Nicky got there, he decided to live on the streets instead. Living on the streets, he got involved in a well-known gang in Brooklyn, and eventually he became their warlord. And his life was consumed with drugs and with alcohol and with brutality, and he was arrested time and time again. In fact, a psychiatrist once said of Nicky Cruz, one day he will end up in jail, he'll end up in the electric chair, and he'll end up in hell. That was a psychiatrist's diagnosis of Nikki. But while Nikki was in this gang and he was on the streets, he ran into a street preacher by the name of David Wilkerson. And David Wilkerson would tell Nikki that God loved him, which Nikki didn't respond too well with. And he would curse him and he would yell at him and he would beat him and threaten him with his life. But David would still tell him, God loves you. In fact, David told him one day, you can chop me up into 1,000 pieces and every piece will still say, God loves you. David Wilkerson held a rally in an arena. And Nikki came to listen to him. And at that rally, David preached about the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus and how it was love that took him to the cross. It was his love that caused him to hang there and to give his life so that we could have life. And as Nikki heard these words, tears just began pouring down his face, and he just recognized his deep need for God. And in that moment, he made a decision to surrender. Not only did Nikki give his life to Christ, but several other gang members gave their lives to Christ as well that night. The next day, Nikki and these other gang members who'd given their lives to Christ, they got their guns, they got their knives, they even got bricks, and they took them all to the police station and turned them in. The police were stunned. They're like, what is this? But they said, this is it. It's done. It's over. He left the gang. He enrolled in Bible college. He got married. Eventually, he went back to New York City and he led a ministry called Teen Challenge to help and to serve these teenagers that were struggling. And in that process, not only did Nikki experience the unfailing love of God, but he became a conduit for the unfailing love of God. That's the power of love. That's the power of God's love to reach into our deepest, darkest valley and to rescue us. Because the thing about God's love and the thing about God's goodness is that they pursue us. You see, in Psalm 23:6, notice what David says here. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me. That word pursue, it's often used to describe an enemy that is pursuing someone, or even like a lion that's pursuing its prey. And David uses the same language to describe God pursuing us. But what he's doing here is he's saying, you know what? God's goodness and God's love will chase me down. God's not pursuing me to kill me. God's not pursuing me because he's mad at me. No, David's saying, hey, let me tell you something I've discovered about this good shepherd that I serve. His love, his goodness are going to chase me down. You see, when you look at the 23rd Psalm, here's a question you have to ask. Who is following who? Who is following who? When you get to this final verse in the Psalm, you discover this. We follow the shepherd, but the shepherd's goodness and love follows us. We follow the shepherd, his goodness and love follows us. We follow the shepherd, his goodness and love follows us. It's like there's this pattern, there's this promise, and yet what we often do is we reverse it, don't we? We pursue goodness. Well, God, I'm going to pursue blessing, I'm going to pursue money, I'm going to pursue opportunity, I'm going to pursue this and that and the other because, man, that's what I really want. We pursue the goodness instead of pursuing the shepherd. Or we pursue the love. We pursue, that relationship with that boyfriend or that girlfriend, or we pursue sex or porn or whatever else we think looks like love. We pursue it instead of pursuing God. And yet David comes along and he says, listen, we don't have to pursue goodness and we don't have to pursue love, because if we pursue the shepherd, then goodness and love will pursue us. So that raises the question, who are you pursuing? Who are you chasing? And here's the beautiful part. When you do that, look at how this psalm ends. Psalm 23, verse 6. It's like he unpacks it just a little bit more. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life. He didn't say it might pursue you. It could on like a good day. His goodness and unfailing love will pursue you, and not just for a day, and not just for a week, and not just for a month, and not just for a year, but every day of your life. Does that mean you won't have hardships? Of course it doesn't mean that. He's already talked about the fact we're going to go through dark valleys, but he was saying, hey, listen, I've got good news for you. In the green pastures and in the dark valleys, his goodness and love still follow you. Beside the quiet waters and on the tabletop that's surrounded by the enemy, my goodness and love still follow you. And today I want you to know that whatever you're in right now and whatever situation you're facing, and no matter how dark and gloomy and deep the valley may seem, I want you to know you have a good shepherd, and you don't have to chase after goodness, and you don't have to chase after love. It will chase after you if you'll chase after him. So who are you chasing today? Let's pray.
Hey, thanks again for being a part of what God's doing here at Seven City Church. We hope you are blessed by today's message. If you'd like to partner with us or get more information, you can go to our website, sevencitychurch.com. Be blessed. Take care.